Hello, and welcome to Trans Truth, the podcast dedicated to dispelling myths, fear, and ignorance about transgender people. Along the way, we'll be sharing items of interest to the transgender community, from political and news events to health, fashion, and beauty. And now, let's have a look at some news items that should be of interest to our listeners. More than 58,000 transgender youth in the U.S. are currently at risk of being stripped of medical support, according to a report released by the Williams Institute on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Law and Public Policy at UCLA. The report goes on to state that more than a third of the 150,000 transgender youth in the United States live in the 15 states that have restricted access to gender-affirming care or are currently considering laws to do so. About half of the laws proposed are also aimed at health insurance or state funding to prevent them from enabling accepted gender-affirming treatment. We put a link to this report in the description for this episode. The ACLU reports that they are tracking approximately 200 anti-trans bills across 30-some states. Close to home, the governor of Texas and his attorney general have tried to use what amounts to executive action to criminalize the provision of gender-affirming health care for minors. Fortunately, the courts have stepped in and issued injunctions against such action, arguing that continuing those investigations could cause irreparable harm. Much of that harm has already been done. At least 2 of the largest health systems in Texas have ceased the providing of such care, and thousands of families with trans kids now live in the very real fear of being torn apart by the actions of a cynical and desperate political party. See the link in the description of this episode for more. The Independent recently published a story wherein they've crunched the numbers on controversial trans swimmer Leah Thomas's performance. In short, the report puts the lie to the notion that girl or women athletes like Thomas enjoy an unfair advantage. Her performance, while impressive, is hardly a standout among collegiate athletes. The report is compelling in its analysis, but heavy with statistics, so we put a link to it in the description of this episode. And finally, as has been widely reported this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed HB 1557, the Don't Say Gay bill, which will restrict educators in the state from discussing certain subjects, require those educators to notify a student's parents, quote, if there is a change in the student's services or monitoring relating to the student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, unquote. On the bright side, CNN.com, link in the description, reports that Disney, the largest employer in Central Florida after initially declining to take a stand, has now publicly turned about. The company's CEO, Bob Chapek, apologized to his LGBT employees, stating, quote, you needed me to be a stronger ally in the fight for equal rights, and I let you down. I am sorry, unquote. The company has stated that it is dedicated to standing up for the rights and safety of LGBTQ members of the Disney family, as well as the LGBT community in Florida and across the country. So, okay, they were a little slow, but they're on the right track now. Hello, I'm Kelly Nelson, she, her, hers, welcoming you to this special edition of Trans Truth. As usual, I am joined by...
I'm Jerry Ann Young.
As you've just heard in our news segment, the widespread Republican strategy of attacking LGBTQ people, and trans kids and their families in particular, is still in full swing. This is not by coincidence. It is a part of a concerted national strategy of a morally bankrupt political party. There are at this time over 130 pieces of anti-LGBT legislation in 35 states. The majority of these bills are targeting trans kids and their families. This is not about protecting the children or ensuring fairness for female athletes, all for the sake of whipping up their right-wing extremist base. This activity is causing massive harm among an already vulnerable population. Now, just as we were sitting down to record this episode, Jerry Ann came up with a piece of breaking news. Do you want to share that with us?
I do. One of my news sources sent me this by email attachment this morning early, and it's a letter from the Department of Justice, and the letter is dated yesterday, March 31st, and the letter is composed and signed by Assistant Attorney General Krista Clark. Now, I've not verified this. This letter seems legit to me. It's got the Department of Justice seal. Seems legit in every way. But the way I understand it, this letter was sent to every attorney general in every state in the country, all 50 attorneys general. And basically what the letter says is that you can't pass laws that single out people. You can't interfere with parents seeking practiced medical treatment for their children. You can't pass laws that against someone because of their gender. Even if it's transgender, it's still gender. The letter speaks of Title IX, the Affordable Care Act, even Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Now, again, I can read this entire letter. It's fascinating reading word by word, but I hate to take that much time because we have an amazing guest tonight.
We will put a link to that document on our website in the notes for this episode. So before we introduce our guest, I just want to point out a couple more things about the way that transgender kids suffer. 30% of foster kids are LGBTQ, and that begs the question, why? Those in the 15 to 24 age bracket who identify as LGBTQ are 120% more likely to become homeless than their straight peers. Again, why? How are these legislative efforts helping anyone but the cynical politicians putting them forth? So our guest tonight is going to answer a whole bunch of the legal questions, we hope, that the current legislation and recent actions by at least the Texas Attorney General. We are joined tonight by Danielle Healy. She is an attorney local to Houston who does a great deal of advocacy and pro bono work for the LGBTQ community. And her day job is as a patent and property attorney. Danielle, welcome to Trans Truth.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you, Jerry. I'm happy to be here. I haven't seen or heard of that letter yet, Jerry, but it certainly is interesting if it's the real deal.
Yeah, I'll forward a copy of it to you as soon as we finish this podcast.
Wonderful.
Well, what made us decide to basically bump Danielle up in our schedule? We had planned on having her on a little bit later in our series, but she called our attention to a move last week by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. I'll let Danielle give us the legal explanation of what it was, but basically Paxton has decided to take on Big Pharma, specifically the companies that manufacture gender-affirming hormones. Danielle, you want to talk about that?
Yes. Interestingly enough, what Attorney General Paxton has done is he has issued what's called a civil investigative demand. This is like a subpoena. It's a demand for documents or information from a party that's being investigated by the Attorney General. The Attorney General only has civil enforcement authority, so they're being investigated for the purpose of potentially bringing a civil lawsuit, not a criminal charge. And the service of the petition of this complaint was on, I believe, AbbVie, which makes hormone blockers, which are used to suppress puberty in trans kids until they're mature enough to make a decision, and Endo Pharmaceuticals, which also makes drugs that are used for puberty treatment. Now, these drugs are, as I understand it, their FDA-approved usages are in treating problems related to puberty, but the off-label use, and many drugs are commonly used off-label by doctors, is to use them to prevent trans kids from going into puberty until they're able to make a conscious decision of how they want to live, and that gives them an enormous advantage, because instead of going through, male puberty and then having to try to reconcile with the emotions and the trauma of going through that as a trans girl, they're able to bypass that. And if they are, as they appear to be and as they're diagnosed, truly trans, then they can go through a hormone treatment. And while they won't have the full-blown female puberty, they will develop much more in the form of females than as males. And the opposite is true for girls who are born biological female, but who are in fact trans boys and trans men.
Right. So he seems to be focusing on the puberty blockers. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's and this is in accordance with the declaration by the Texas Department of Child Protective Services that doing any type of interference with a minor's gender or providing any medical care to help a minor who's suffering from gender dysphoria or who's transgender is felony child abuse under Texas law. So he's going against the big pharma companies to try to make a statement, pound his drum, make a show, because he's gotten a lot of blowback, and I believe his direct efforts against children and parents have now been enjoined by the courts in Texas.
That's true. There is at least one lawsuit brought by the ACLU and Lambda Legal, if I'm not mistaken, that has resulted in an injunction against the state doing any further investigation of trans parents. But getting back to the puberty blockers, I wanted to make sure that everybody understands how important that is, because once a trans girl, a genetic boy, goes through male puberty, essentially irreversible changes take place. Beard growth, changes in their body, and their voice changing. Coming from the three lady baritones here, that's a tough thing to live with, a really tough thing to live with.
It is. And, also, I believe female hormones, when they're administered later, will prevent the biologically male children from reaching their full height or getting that male muscle development that is now the subject of these trans girls in sports complaints. So the bottom line is, if you have a trans girl who, say, since 5, 6, 7, 8 has been living as a female and socially transitioned and getting appropriate psychological and other care, when they get to be 12 or so, going through male puberty would be a nightmare. It would be emotionally devastating.